The Lady in Black, When the Past Trembles. 5 years had passed since Josephine last left Bellamonte, humiliated, discredited, carrying in her womb the child of a man who lacked the courage to defend her. But time is a silent artisan. It stitches scars, polishes the soul, and sometimes transforms wounds into armor. Now, she was back. At the entrance to the city, an elegant carriage stopped. The coachman descended, opened the door, and from it emerged a woman dressed in black from head to toe. It wasn't mourning, it was command. Her dress, made of noble fabric and with a precise cut, swayed in the wind as a sign that nothing would be as before. A veiled hat partially obscured her face, but not enough to prevent the most observant from recognizing her striking green eyes. Josephine had returned to Bellamonte. News of her arrival swept through the city like lightning. Merchants closed their doors for an instant just to watch her pass. The curious peeked through windows. Former factory colleagues whispered in groups. Even the church bells seemed to ring louder that day. She walked with firm steps and her head held high, accompanied by 2 assistants carrying her belongings. She was no longer the humble young woman who scrubbed the factory corridors. Now she was the sole owner of Marshall chocolates, the legitimate heir to everything that once belonged to Augustus. At the mansion door, Josephine paused. She took a deep breath. It was here that the new phase would begin. The same place where she had been silently welcomed would now be the stage for her resurgence. She opened the doors with the authority of someone who no longer asked for permission. She commanded. On the same day, word spread that Josephine would personally reopen the factory offices. She hadn't returned just to manage. She had returned to look into the eyes of all who had once humiliated her and show that there was no longer any room for submission. Victoria, of course, was one of the first to tremble at the news. "She's back?" she asked, pale, nervously fiddling with her pearl necklace. By what right? But deep down, she knew. Josephine now had more than just rights. She had a name, power, and a voice. Julian, in turn, felt a different kind of shock. The inevitable reunion made him uneasy. In his mind, the memory of the young woman he loved and let slip away was a wound never fully healed. Now she was returning stronger, more beautiful, and more distant than ever. And with a child who might be his. That night, Josephine went up to the mansion's terrace and looked out at the illuminated city. Bellamonte slept, oblivious to what was coming. But she knew it was only just beginning. There would still be confrontations, revelations, and difficult decisions. But now the fragile girl had disappeared. In her place stood the Lady in Black, and the past would begin to tremble. The confrontation with the ghosts of the past. The morning after her arrival, Josephine decided to make her first public appearance strategically. She sent no invitations, made no announcements. She simply appeared, like a silent thunderclap, walking through the front door of the factory that now bore her surname, Marshall Chocolates. The employees stopped what they were doing. The sound of the machines ceased for a few seconds. It was as if time had frozen. Some recognized her immediately. Others took a moment to believe that this elegant woman, with her firm stride and impeccable posture, was the same young woman who once scrubbed the floors of that place with her head bowed. Josephine crossed the main courtyard without saying a word. Her heels echoed like small war drums on the concrete floor. She walked confidently, as if each step declared, "I'm back, and I don't need to ask permission for it." Upon reaching the old director's office, now hers, she found Jezebel, Augustus's sister-in-law, and one of the first to question the validity of the will. Jezebel, with her arrogant pose and scornful gaze, stood up as if trying to maintain control of the situation. "Ah, Josephine," she said with a cold smile. "Or should I call you Mrs. Marshall now?" Josephine, unperturbed, simply replied calmly, "As you prefer. But what truly matters is that this room, this factory, and every payroll now pass through my hands." Jezebel narrowed her eyes, realizing that her days of influence were numbered. But that was just the first ghost to be faced. Later that day, Josephine walked to the city center. There, in front of the confectionery where she had so often been scorned, she saw Victoria, impeccable as always, but with a slight tremor in her hands upon seeing her. Sitting with other ladies of the local elite, Victoria stood up with a false smile plastered on her face. "What a surprise, Josephine," she said, extending her hand. "I see you're different." Josephine stared at her for a few seconds. The past simmered beneath her skin, but she was no longer guided by anger. Her reply came serene, yet sharp as a razor. "Time changes everything, Victoria. Even what once seemed small and insignificant grows and flourishes." Victoria did not reply. She knew that at that moment she was standing before a woman she could no longer control, ridicule, or diminish. Josephine had won, and the gaze around her, once of scorn, was now of curiosity, respect, and fear. By the end of that day, all of Bellamonte was buzzing. Josephine has returned to settle scores. But she wasn't seeking cheap revenge. Her objective was deeper, to show that no one has the right to destroy another person's dignity, to show that a woman's strength lies not in her surname, but in her courage to start anew even after falling. Josephine knew she would still face many battles, legal disputes, malicious glances, intrigues. But one thing was clear. She was no longer the naive young woman who believed in sweet promises. Now, she was a woman forged of iron and heart, ready to face all the ghosts of the past, head on. And Bellamonte was only just beginning to understand what that meant. Julian, between regret and guilt, Julian was no longer the thoughtless young man of 5 years ago. Time had stolen the lightness from his gaze and given him, in return, sleepless nights and a weight that wouldn't dissipate. Regret. Since the day he saw Josephine humiliated at the ball, he carried guilt like a constant shadow, especially for having remained silent, for not defending her, for having given in to family pressure and Victoria's whims. He tried to move on. He had other relationships, empty commitments, parties, and promises that were never fulfilled. But the image of Josephine, with tear-filled eyes, smudged makeup, and a broken heart, haunted him at every turn of memory. And now, she was back. Not as the simple girl who loved him with innocence, but as a powerful lady, heiress to a fortune, mother of a boy whom, in Bellamonte's corridors, many said was his. Julian knew of her arrival even before he saw her. The whispers at the club, the agitated glances at the confectionery, and the rumors from the factory were enough. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment he saw her with his own eyes. She appeared in the main square, walking with impeccable posture, dressed in black and surrounded by stairs. Julian stopped breathing for a few seconds. The world seemed to spin in slow motion. There she was, Josephine, the woman he loved and left. And everything inside him screamed. He thought about going to her, about apologizing right there, in public, about saying he regretted it, that he had been a coward, that he thought of her every day. But his feet wouldn't move. And Josephine didn't see him, or if she did, she pretended not to. That night, Julian was alone in his room, staring at the dark ceiling, lost in thought. Daniel, her son. Was he really his son? The calculations matched, the memories too, but she never sought him out, never sent a letter, never spoke of paternity. That hurt. But he understood. Perhaps he didn't deserve to know. The next day, he summoned his courage. He dressed carefully, rehearsed words in the mirror, and went to the Marshall mansion. Upon arriving, he was greeted by a maid who politely asked him to wait. Josephine received him in the living room, impeccable, sober, restrained. He smiled nervously. "You look beautiful, Josephine." She merely nodded. The silence between them was thick, as if holding everything that had been left unsaid over the years. I don't even know where to begin," he said, slowly sitting down. "But I need to ask for forgiveness, for everything, for leaving you at that ball, for not having the courage to protect you, for not coming after you. I was an idiot." Josephine stared at him. Her gaze was no longer that of a girl in love, but that of a wounded woman who had learned to rise alone. "Julian, your regret comes too late. The wound has already become a scar, and I am no longer the one who believed in easy promises." He nodded, swallowing his pride. "And Daniel?" he asked, hesitant. "Is he my son?" Josephine took a deep breath. She wanted to say yes, she wanted to scream, but she also wanted to protect him, and to protect herself. There was too much involved now. Power, inheritance, interests. What Daniel is doesn't change what you failed to be. A father isn't just blood, Julian, it's presence. Julian lowered his eyes, defeated. She stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. He understood. That day, he left the mansion with a heavier heart than when he entered. He knew that regaining Josephine's trust, and perhaps his son's love, would be his greatest battle, and perhaps his last chance. The challenges of fortune, envy, and ambition. With the Marshall name now officially under her signature, Josephine not only inherited a fortune, she also inherited a throne surrounded by thorns. Being the owner of the region's largest chocolate factory meant facing gazes that would never become entirely friendly, especially from those who believed that such wealth should never have left the lineage of noble blood. The first threat came from within, Jezebel. Apparently she remained cordial, always with soft words and a smile on her lips, but behind the facade, she plotted silently. Jezebel had lived much of her life in Augustus's shadow, and with his death, expected to assume a central role in the family empire. Josephine's arrival, a former cleaner, a widow of convenience, mother of an unknown child, was an affront Jezebel would never swallow. Soon, documents began to mysteriously disappear from the company headquarters. Meetings were sabotaged, and some old advisors began to pressure Josephine to sign dubious contracts. Behind these maneuvers was Jezebel, using her influence and contacts to try and undermine the new heiress's authority. However, she didn't count on something new in Josephine: astuteness. During her years in Argentina, Josephine studied finance, administration, and corporate law. Augustus prepared her not only to be a lady, but to be a leader. She began to detect the frauds, investigate the leaks, and little by little, replaced disloyal employees with trustworthy people. She assembled a small group of loyal allies, led by an old factory accountant who had always admired Augustus's ethics. But Jezebel was not alone. Victoria, resentful of having lost Julian and her social influence, decided to ally with her sister-in-law. After all, nothing unites more than a common enemy. Together, they hatched a subtle campaign to destroy Josephine's reputation, spreading rumors, questioning the legality of the will, and most importantly, feeding doubt surrounding Daniel's paternity. What kind of man would leave everything to a child that isn't his? Victoria insinuated at dinners and social gatherings. Perhaps she tricked him with some sob story, she would say, with an air of false compassion. The rumors spread, forcing Josephine to face not only business pressure, but also the weight of public judgment. Women who once admired her began to avoid her. Old friends of Augustus distanced themselves. Even some factory employees began to treat her with veiled coldness. Even so, Josephine did not yield. Instead of fleeing, she organized a charity event in Augustus's name. Opening the factory gates to the community, she presented social projects, improvements in labor rights, and a company expansion plan that would benefit the city. The elite grumbled, but the people began to see her with new eyes. Still, the threats persisted. Jezebel filed a lawsuit alleging that Augustus was not of sound mind when drafting the will. Victoria hired a detective to try and prove that Josephine had had an affair before the marriage and that Daniel was the result of a hidden scandal. Josephine, in turn, stood firm. She knew the fortune was a blessing, but also a test of courage, intelligence, and patience. She was now fighting not only for what she inherited, but for what she built: respect, dignity, and her son's future. The power play in Bellamonte was underway, and Josephine, armed with knowledge and deep scars, had no intention of losing. Because some inheritances aren't made of money, they're made of strength. The presence of Daniel, the bond no one understands. Daniel grew into a sweet, curious, and extremely intelligent boy, with dark brown hair and lively eyes that resembled both Josephine's and, though she avoided admitting it aloud, Julian's. It was impossible to ignore how much the boy stood out, not only in appearance but also in his gentle demeanor and the firm upbringing his mother instilled in him. In the Marshall mansion, the little one filled the space with lightness, running through the gardens, asking about everything, wanting to understand the world. But although he was a joyful boy, there was a kind of sensitivity in him that only someone born under the shadow of a secret would be able to carry. Josephine always tried to shield him from the malicious glances and whispers that passed through walls. But Bellamonte was a town that never forgot, and sharp tongues sooner or later found their victims. Some children at school whispered among themselves, "They say his father wasn't even the factory owner. He doesn't even have a father. He's nobody's child." These phrases, small as droplets, slowly fell upon Daniel. One day, arriving home with teary eyes, he quietly asked, "Mommy, why do people say I'm different?" Josephine knelt before him, holding his face with both hands. "Because you are, my love, different for being special, for coming into the world with a greater purpose. Don't listen to what others say. What matters is who you are, and you are my son. That is enough." But she knew that sooner or later she would have to tell him the truth. Daniel couldn't grow up in a protective bubble, and, above all, he had the right to know his origin. The problem was, did Julian deserve that place as a father? Even from a distance, Julian observed Daniel from afar, in brief, discreet moments. The boy was growing, and with him, the resemblance also grew. Julian's heart ached whenever he saw him playing in the square, or when he heard his light laughter echoing through the city streets. One afternoon, the two met by chance. Daniel, as always curious, didn't recognize Julian as his father, but noticed something familiar. They talked about birds, about chocolate, and Julian, with tears in his eyes, wanted to embrace him like a father, but he didn't dare. After that encounter, Josephine was sought out. "Josephine," Julian said, his voice choked, "I don't want to fight or take anything from you. I just wanted to know my son, to be able to be near him." She took a deep breath. She felt torn between the protection she had always given Daniel and the justice Julian perhaps deserved. But there was still much to resolve. The wounds were not fully closed. "Julian, a father isn't just biological presence, it's dedication. And you still need to show me you're ready for that. Not just for me, but for him." And he understood. He asked for nothing more. He simply said goodbye with a wave and the silent promise that he would keep trying. Meanwhile, Daniel, unaware of everything, continued to grow. He was the bridge between two worlds, between the past Josephine tried to forget and the future she fought to build. In that boy there was more than just blood. There was hope, and perhaps redemption. The shocking revelation: Daniel, the lost son. The city of Bellamonte, though small, lived on big secrets, and one of them, perhaps the biggest of all, was about to come to light. It was a dormant truth, a knot tied for years in Josephine's heart. But like every truth that hides for too long, it began to knock on the door of reality, demanding to be set free. Josephine knew she couldn't keep Daniel from the truth forever. Every day, he asked more questions. The resemblance to Julian was striking, and even the townsfolk, once hesitant to comment, now openly whispered. It was during a solemn dinner at the mansion that everything began to unravel. The event brought together important figures of the city, businessmen, local politicians, and people connected to the Marshall family. Josephine organized everything with elegance, transforming the reception into a symbol of her new phase as the factory's leader and a respected woman in society. Julian was also there, invited out of courtesy, but he felt out of place, restless. Throughout the night, his eyes searched for Daniel among the guests. The boy, with his typical curiosity, charmed everyone with his good manners and intelligence. Until, in a moment of silence between speeches and toasts, the inevitable happened. An elderly lady, an old friend of Augustus, stood up and with an enigmatic smile commented loudly enough to be heard, "What a charming boy, Josephine, and how much he resembles his father. But not Augustus, isn't that right?" The room plunged into a deathly silence. The clinking of glasses stopped. All eyes turned to Josephine and then to Julian. There was something in the air, like a veil about to be torn. Josephine remained motionless for a few seconds. She knew this was the moment. She could evade once more, invent an elegant reply, change the subject. But she didn't. She stood up, wiped the corners of her mouth with her napkin, and took a deep breath. Since the city's curiosity is insatiable, perhaps it's time to clarify. Yes, Daniel is Julian's son. A whisper swept through the room like a cutting wind. Victoria's eyes widened, surprised and furious. Jezebel let wine spill from her glass. And Julian brought his hand to his mouth, stifling a sob. Daniel, who was still too young to understand the impact of that revelation, simply looked at his mother with wide, innocent eyes. "Does this change anything?" he asked softly, as if fearing to lose his footing. Josephine knelt down to him, looked into her son's eyes, and replied sweetly, "Only one thing, now you know the truth. But everything that truly matters remains the same. I am your mother, and I will always be with you." Julian approached, trembling. "Josephine, why didn't you tell me?" "Because at that time you weren't ready," she replied without resentment. "I had to choose between protecting my son or insisting on a man who turned his back on me when I needed him most." He nodded, understanding the pain behind that decision. "And now?" he asked. "Can I be a part of his life?" Josephine looked at Daniel, then at Julian. "That no longer depends only on me. It depends on the two of you. But it's in your hands." That night, Bellamonte had more than an elegant dinner. It had a confession, a liberation, a secret that for years had been whispered in corners was now public. And in the midst of it all was Daniel. No longer nobody's child, but the child of two worlds, that of lost love and hard-won strength. The boy who would change everything. The unmasking of Victoria, the final revenge. Victoria had always been driven by a blind force, the need to win. From a young age, she learned that in Bellamonte, prestige was worth more than character, and appearance more than truth. So when Julian showed interest in Josephine, she saw not just a rival in love, but a threat to her social status. From then on, her objective was clear: to destroy Josephine, whatever the cost. But years passed, and to her dismay, that humble young woman she had publicly humiliated not only survived, but was reborn stronger. Josephine was now the face of the Marshall fortune, acclaimed in the city for her elegance, firmness, and generosity. Victoria, no matter how hard she tried to maintain her composure, felt the ground slipping beneath her feet. Disturbed by the revelation that Daniel was Julian's son, she saw in it a final opportunity for revenge. If she could prove that Josephine had deceived Augustus to secure the inheritance, she could place her under legal suspicion, destroy her image, and perhaps regain control of the factory with Jezebel's support. With this plan in mind, Victoria hired a private investigator from outside the city. She paid a fortune to scour Josephine's past, looking for any slip-up, any omission, any letter or witness who could suggest that the marriage to Augustus had been a sham, or worse, a manipulation. For weeks, she spied on Josephine's every move. She invaded her privacy with disguised phone calls, bribes to employees, even hidden listening devices. Each day, the obsession grew, but nothing emerged. Josephine was clean, unquestionable, until, in a blunder, Victoria fell into her own trap. One of the bribed employees, uncomfortable with his boss's methods, discreetly sought out Julian. He handed over documents and audio recordings that proved Victoria's espionage scheme, in addition to recorded conversations where she manipulated information to defame Josephine at dinners and social gatherings. Indignant, Julian brought everything to Josephine. She listened to the recordings with serenity. Inside, her heart ached, reliving so many attacks disguised as smiles. But with a cool head, she decided what to do. The following week, during a meeting of the factory board, where Victoria was a frequent presence, even without a position, Josephine appeared with an envelope in hand. Dressed in an impeccable white suit, contrasting with the black of her arrival in the city, she now seemed the very image of justice. "Before we begin, there's something that needs to be clarified," she said, her voice firm. She handed the envelope to the board president. Inside were the recordings, the investigators' reports, and the testimonies of the bribed employees. Victoria tried to interrupt, but Josephine silenced her with a gesture. "Spreading rumors is cruel. Spying and trying to destroy a mother and her child is unforgivable." The room fell silent. Jezebel paled. Victoria, cornered, tried to deny it, but the audio spoke for itself. The board voted, and Victoria was officially banned from any connection with the factory's business. Her name, once respected, became synonymous with shame. And what hurt her most wasn't losing prestige, it was having definitively lost Julian. Upon learning of the whole plot, he confronted her with scorn in his eyes. "You destroyed any affection I might have had for you," he said. "Never seek me out again." Josephine didn't celebrate. She just breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't about victory. It was about justice. Victoria, finally, was unmasked. Her mask of nobility fell, revealing the face of envy. And Josephine, without even needing to raise her voice, won with the greatest of weapons, the truth. True justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation. After the scandal that swept Bellamonte, with Victoria's public downfall and the end of Jezebel's attempts against her reputation, Josephine finally felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. But true peace, she would soon realize, doesn't just come when enemies fall silent. It comes when the heart also quiets. Throughout her journey, from cleaning to fortune, from humiliation to power, Josephine had armed herself with courage, determination, and discipline. But now, with the battlefield cleared, it remained to face the most intimate war, the one within herself. One morning, sitting on the mansion's veranda with a cup of tea in her hands, She watched Daniel play with a wooden airplane. It was impressive how, even so small, he had an unusual sensitivity. He turned, ran to her, and asked, "Mommy, now that we've won, are you happy?" The question, so innocent, disarmed her. She smiled, but didn't answer immediately. Because deep down, victory didn't feel as sweet as she imagined. There was a bitterness there, as if something still tied her to the past. That same week, she did something unexpected. She sought out Victoria. Yes, the same woman who dragged her to public humiliation, who tried to defame her, who plotted against her son. But Josephine knew that to be truly free, she needed to close this cycle, and that would only be possible with a gesture few would understand: forgiveness. Victoria was secluded in her mother's house, dejected, far from the spotlight and parties. When she saw Josephine at the door, her eyes widened. "What do you want? Have you come to finish destroying me?" Josephine shook her head, serene. "No, Victoria, I didn't come as an enemy. I came as a woman." Victoria hesitated. She stepped aside. The conversation between them was difficult, honest, and full of pauses. Josephine spoke about the pains she carried, about the invisible wounds, about the loneliness. Victoria, little by little, dismantled her armor of arrogance, and for the first time in a long time, cried real tears. "I just wanted to be loved," she whispered, "and I was so afraid of being forgotten." Josephine held her hand. "I know, but fear doesn't justify cruelty. Even so, I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to live in peace." It was a silent but profound moment. When Josephine left, something inside her had changed. And as life has its curious way of responding to sincere gestures, days later, it was Julian who sought her out. "I heard what you did for Victoria," he said. "That just confirms what I always knew. You are the strongest woman I've ever met." Josephine smiled, but not as before. There was lightness in her gaze. "I fought hard, Julian, but now I don't want to fight anymore. I want to live." He looked at her tenderly. "And will you allow me to be a part of it?" Josephine studied him for a few seconds, as if evaluating not the man in front of her, but the man he could become. And then she replied, "That depends on you, on how you will act, on how you will care for our son. I don't need promises, Julian. I need presence." He nodded, emotional. "I want to try, with all my heart." And so, without eternal vows, without background music, without spectacular endings, they took the first step to start anew. Because sometimes true justice is not in punishing, but in forgiving. And reconciliation, when sincere, is the most powerful form of justice that exists. Julian's heart, the fight for reconciliation. After so many years living with guilt, Julian felt he had finally found a path, narrow, delicate, but real, to reconnect with Josephine, and above all, with Daniel. But forgiveness isn't a gift received immediately. It's a process. And Julian knew that, this time, pretty words wouldn't be enough. He decided it wasn't enough to say he had changed. He needed to show it. So he began discreetly attending Daniel's school, watching from a distance his performances, meetings, and games. He never approached without permission, but his constant presence didn't go unnoticed. Daniel, though still confused by the idea of having a father, began to notice that smiling man in the audience, at the gates, in the vicinity. At first, he just exchanged glances. But, over time, he started to approach. "You again?" he asked one day, with a curious little smile. "I guess I like watching you play," Julian replied, trying to contain his emotion. "You're good at it." "My mom says I'm good at many things," the boy answered, proud. "And you? What are you good at?" Julian was surprised by the question. He thought for a moment. "I'm trying to be good at being present." Daniel was silent. Then he nodded, as if not understanding everything. but accepting. And from then on, the connection began to form. In parallel, Julian sought to rebuild his path with Josephine as well. It wasn't easy. There were days when she received him with a gentle look, others when she maintained her distance. She didn't want to reopen old wounds, but she also didn't want to close doors to someone who showed sincere effort. One night, Julian appeared with something unexpected, an old photo album. "Remember this?" he asked, handing her the object. "These are photos from our school days, from the picnic by the river, from the spring dance." Josephine leafed through the pages carefully. Some photos brought shy smiles to her face, others silent tears. "You kept all this?" "I kept you," he replied, with a sparkle in his eyes. "Even when I was a coward, you never left me." She closed the album and took a deep breath. "Julian, I learned to be enough for myself, to fight alone. I don't know if I can open up space again." "Then let me build that space," he pleaded sincerely. "I don't want what was. I want what can still be." That week, Julian also began to get involved in social actions promoted by the factory, helping with the educational projects Josephine led. He participated without seeking applause, just to be closer, to show commitment. The people of Bellamonte, who once viewed him with some contempt, began to change their opinion. They saw in him no longer the spoiled young man who had turned his back on a pregnant woman, but a man trying to make things right. Josephine observed everything, not with naivete that she had left in the past, but with a more mature, realistic gaze. Julian still needed to prove many things, but there was truth in his actions. And Daniel, Daniel, was already starting to call him Dad naturally. It wasn't daily, nor constant, but it was genuine. And for Julian, hearing that word was like hearing his own soul being rescued. He knew that reconciliation was not a destination, but a path to be walked, and he was willing to follow it, one step at a time, with an open heart. Because sometimes, a man's greatest act of courage is not to conquer, but to regain what he lost out of fear. And Julian finally was ready to fight for that. A happy ending, building a new chapter. After so many storms, trials, and revealed secrets, Josephine finally began to feel the sweet taste of the peace she had so longed for. The Marshall factory was not just a company, it was a symbol of overcoming adversity, strength, and transformation. She had changed Bellamonte, but more importantly, she had changed herself. Daniel, now 7 years old, grew up surrounded by his mother's unconditional love and, little by little, by Julian's constant presence. The boy knew the truth about his origin, and although the journey to acceptance was not linear, what prevailed was the genuine affection that united them. Josephine and Julian, after many meetings, disagreements, difficult words, and sincere gestures, had found a balance. It wasn't a perfect love. No love is. But it was a true love, built on respect, trust, and the will to grow together. On that sunny morning, the Marshall mansion was decorated for a party. It wasn't a business event or a social gathering for the elite. It was a celebration of life, family, and new beginnings. Distinguished guests from the city were gathered, but Josephine, Julian, and Daniel stole the show. They smiled together, shared stories, and planned the future, a future that once seemed distant and impossible. Josephine, in a light dress and with a bright gaze, looked around and felt warmth in her chest. Her journey, which began with humiliations and doubts, had transformed into a beautiful story of triumph. She approached Julian, who was holding Daniel's hand. "You know, Julian," she said, "I never imagined we would get here, that we would manage to heal the wounds of the past and build something together." Julian smiled. "Me neither, but every step was worth it." Daniel, curious, asked, "Mommy, Daddy, are we going to be a family forever?" Josephine and Julian exchanged a loving glance. "Yes, my son," Josephine replied, moved. "Family is where there's love, and we have a lot of that." The party continued with music, laughter, and dancing. Bellamonte watched, admiring, the transformation of the young cleaner who became a strong woman, a respected leader, and above all, a devoted mother. But that was just the beginning. Josephine knew that life would still bring challenges, but now she had by her side not only the fortune of Augustus Marshall, but also the strength of unity, friendship, and true love. And so, amidst applause and promises, Josephine, Julian, and Daniel wrote the first chapter of a new story. A story where the past serves as a lesson, and the future is a blank page ready to be filled. Because in the end, true wealth isn't in money or power. It's in the people we love, the choices we make, and the courage to start anew, always. This story shows us that even in the face of the greatest difficulties, the strength of heart and the courage to start over can transform lives. That true justice goes far beyond revenge. It is born from forgiveness, love, and overcoming. If Josephine's journey moved you, don't forget to like, share with those who need to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring and emotional stories. See you next time.